You don't get to muzzle the truth. That's the energy Jasmine Crockett brought to the moment, and it resonated like a lightning bolt through the room. The issue on the table wasn't just numbers or policy jargon, it was the very real suffering of Americans under the crushing weight of prescription drug costs. Crockett didn't come to play games. She came with purpose, with clarity, and with a refusal to let anyone derail the urgent conversation about the corporate greed that has hijacked healthcare in this country. When she began speaking, it wasn't just a speech. It was a call to conscience. Her voice carried the frustration of millions who've had to decide between filling a prescription and buying groceries. She wasn't going to let the moment be deflected or drowned out by empty rhetoric. She came armed with truth. And when that truth made people uncomfortable, she didn't back down. She leaned in harder. What made her delivery so powerful was that it wasn't about grandstanding. It was about representation. She didn't raise her voice for the sake of attention. She raised it because the people she represents don't always have one in those rooms. She refused to let those voices be silenced again, especially on a matter so central to their survival. Her passion didn't come off as political theater. It came from lived experience, community pain, and a burning sense of justice. There's a long and painful history in this country of important conversations being sidelined or sanitized to avoid discomfort. People get nervous when someone speaks with raw, unfiltered truth, especially when that truth exposes how deeply rigged the system is. But Crockett understood something essential. Change doesn't come from politeness. It comes from persistence. And in that moment, she was persistence personified. When attempts were made to interrupt her, to shift the narrative, to dilute the message, she stood taller. Her refusal to yield wasn't about ego. It was about accountability. It was about making sure that the realities faced by everyday people weren't once again buried under parliamentary procedures or empty sound bites. She wasn't disruptive. She was determined. And that determination was a direct response to years of policy neglect and political indifference. Her voice was sharp, but it wasn't mean. It was direct, because indirect language doesn't cut through systemic problems. She spoke plainly, because the people she fights for don't have time for double talk. They're not asking for favors, they're asking for fairness. And she was damn sure going to make that clear, whether it made people squirm or not. In that moment, Crockett redefined what it means to stay in your place. For too long, that phrase has been used to keep people, especially women, especially black women, quiet when they dare to challenge power. But she didn't just stay in her place, she owned the room. She reminded everyone that her place is exactly where she stood, at the microphone, speaking truth to a system that too often pretends not to hear. There was electricity in the way she reclaimed that space. You could feel the tension, not just from those trying to shut her down, but from the sheer force of her will breaking through years of bureaucratic complacency. Her words were not just statements, they were a form of resistance, a refusal to accept that silence is the price of participation. And let's be clear, she wasn't just pushing back for herself. She was pushing back for every person who's ever had their pain dismissed or their struggle ignored. Every person who's ever been told that their voice was too loud, too angry, too disruptive, when all they were doing was telling the truth. In a world where powerful interests are counting on silence, her refusal to be silenced was revolutionary. She turned what could have been just another dull committee moment into something unforgettable, something necessary, something real. The truth she carried couldn't be muzzled, and in choosing to speak it, she gave others permission to do the same. This ain't just politics. This is people's lives. That was the fire behind every word Jasmine Crockett delivered when she addressed the issue of drug prices. She cut through the fog of partisanship and grandstanding, drilling down to what truly matters. The lived experiences of millions of Americans who suffer not because we lack the medical knowledge or resources to care for them, but because of deliberate policy choices that put profits over people. When Crockett spoke, it wasn't in the stale, overly rehearsed tone of career politicians. It was real, urgent. You could feel that she wasn't speaking about abstract policy or distant theoretical models. She was speaking about her constituents, about families waking up every morning to the harsh reality that their access to life-saving medications depends on how much money they have in their checking account. She was speaking for the parent rationing insulin, for the senior skipping doses, for the single mother juggling 3 jobs and still unable to afford the medication her child needs. Too often, debates around healthcare are hijacked by ideological talking points and performative outrage. But Crockett made it impossible to ignore the human faces behind the statistics. This was not about red states or blue states. This was about a broken system that's failing people in every corner of the country. And she wasn't about to let anyone twist this into a political chess match. She made it clear. This isn't a game. The stakes are too high. In her voice was the pain of communities who have long been left behind by a healthcare system designed to enrich a few while denying many. She spoke with clarity about how drug pricing isn't just a pocketbook issue, it's a moral crisis. A society that lets the sick go untreated while billion-dollar pharmaceutical companies rake in record profits is a society in need of a serious reckoning. And Crockett wasn't there to be polite about it. She was there to demand change. There's a strength that comes from knowing you speak for people who rarely get the chance to be heard. That strength powered every sentence. She wasn't begging for attention. She was commanding it because she knew the stories she carried deserved to be front and center. And in that moment, she held the room accountable. No one could pretend this was just another committee meeting. No one could pretend this was business as usual. The courage it takes to speak truth in those spaces, where decorum often means staying quiet while injustice goes unchecked, shouldn't be underestimated. Crockett didn't shrink herself to fit the mold. She expanded the moment to fit the truth. And the truth is, Americans are dying not from a lack of science, but from a lack of political will. That truth deserved to be said, loudly, unapologetically, and without interruption. She connected the dots clearly. This wasn't just about what's happening in Washington. This was about what's happening at pharmacy counters, kitchen tables, emergency rooms. It's about the ripple effect of one unaffordable prescription. A missed dose turns into a hospital visit turns into debt, and debt turns into a lifetime of economic insecurity. All because a pill that costs pennies to make is priced like luxury real estate. And while others in the room may have wanted to reduce this crisis to numbers on a chart, Crockett reminded everyone that behind every number is a name, a face, a story. She didn't just demand action, she demanded empathy. That's a rare thing in spaces dominated by cold calculation. But it's exactly what this fight needs. There was an unmistakable sense that she was pushing the conversation beyond comfort zones. That was the point. Because comfort is a luxury the people she represents can't afford. They don't get to opt out of this crisis. They live it every day. And she brought their urgency with her, made it impossible to ignore. Every interruption, every dismissive glance, she met it with more resolve. Because she knew the goal wasn't to win a debate, it was to tell the truth. A truth that too many are too afraid to say. The system is not just broken, it's rigged, and no one should have to beg for medicine in the richest country on earth. Receipts, baby. She brought them. Jasmine Crockett didn't just step into that room with passion. She stepped in with proof. In a political landscape where too many rely on sound bites and vague generalities, she brought the one thing that cuts through all the noise. Evidence, hard facts, documented reality. And she delivered it with the confidence of someone who knows she's standing on solid ground. It wasn't enough for her to say that the system is broken. She showed it. With reports, with data, with detailed examples of pharmaceutical companies, raking in massive profits while patients suffer. She laid it all out in black and white. No fluff, no filler. Just the receipts. Every dollar of CEO bonuses, every chart showing skyrocketing drug prices, every statistic detailing how Americans pay more for medication than any other country on earth. It was all there. And it was undeniable. That's what made her presence so powerful. She didn't rely on emotional appeals alone, even though the topic is deeply emotional. She did the work. She brought the research. She did what every lawmaker should do before speaking. She prepared, and she prepared with purpose. There was no guesswork in her words. There was accuracy. She wasn't offering an opinion. She was issuing a reality check. You could tell from the way she delivered her points that she'd seen the receipts before, and that she'd lived with the consequences of what those receipts represent. This wasn't just about numbers to her. The reports and statistics she shared weren't theoretical. They were connected to real people. Each data point represented someone struggling, someone making impossible choices. And that's what made her arguments so sharp. They were anchored in both evidence and empathy. When others try to sweep the issue under the rug, pretending that the system works just fine, she brought receipts that tore that lie to pieces. She highlighted how drugs developed with public funding end up priced out of reach for the very public that paid for them. She showed how executive compensation in the pharmaceutical industry climbs higher and higher while patients are crushed under the cost of their prescriptions. These weren't emotional claims, they were verifiable truths. And she didn't just rely on one or two flashy facts. She came with a full body of proof. Legislative records, industry earnings reports, consumer data, every layer of the crisis was backed up. She came to expose a pattern, not just a problem. And she did it with precision. For every attempt to dismiss or deflect, she had a counterpunch of evidence ready to go. She knew the tactics, and she was already 10 steps ahead, in Nye. An environment where misinformation can spread faster than the truth. Her approach was refreshing and necessary. Because when someone comes prepared, it's not just impressive, it's powerful. It shuts down spin, it corners denial, it forces the conversation to stay grounded in reality. And that's what she did. She refused to let the facts be twisted or ignored. Even when interruptions came, even when the temperature in the room rose, she kept her focus locked in. She had the facts in front of her and the fire behind her. Her delivery was assertive, yes, but more than that, it was surgical. She dismantled the talking points and replaced them with truth, line by line, report by report, page by page. That kind of preparation doesn't happen overnight. It's the product of deep engagement, of caring enough to dig into the details that others gloss over. And it's what makes her voice in these conversations so crucial. Because while others may rely on recycled rhetoric, she came armed with the receipts, and that changed the entire tone of the discussion. In moments like this, credibility matters. Facts matter. And Crockett proved that you can't argue with a well-researched case delivered with conviction. Her facts were not just paper armor. They were steel. And when deployed with her level of energy and clarity, they became undeniable. She wasn't just speaking truth to power, she was proving it step by step with every word and every receipt in hand. The voice of the people just got louder, and Jasmine Crockett made sure of that. In a setting where voices like hers are often expected to stay within polite, pre-approved boundaries, she did the exact opposite. She amplified what too many in power try to ignore. The righteous frustration of everyday Americans who are fed up with a system that constantly asks them to sacrifice while protecting corporate greed. Her refusal to shrink in that moment wasn't just about personal conviction. It was about collective empowerment. Crockett wasn't just speaking for herself. She was channeling a much larger truth. She represented people who never get a microphone. People whose pain doesn't trend, whose stories don't make the evening news. She spoke with the urgency of someone who understands that silence doesn't protect the vulnerable, it protects the powerful. And she wasn't about to let that dynamic go unchallenged. Her voice, unwavering and sharp, became a vessel for those who've been conditioned to believe their experiences don't matter in the halls of Congress. She made clear that speaking out isn't disrespect, it's necessary. For far too long, marginalized communities have been told to wait their turn, to be patient, to let the system work itself out. But Crockett shattered that tired expectation. She embodied the truth that justice delayed is justice denied, especially when it comes to something as basic as access to affordable medicine. And in that room, she made sure no one could ignore it any longer. Her words weren't just statements, they were declarations of presence. She claimed space, not just for herself, but for everyone who has been told to sit down, calm down, or stay quiet. Every sentence she spoke was layered with the weight of generations who've demanded justice and been told to lower their voices. But she didn't lower hers, she raised it. And in doing so, she gave permission to others watching, especially young women of color, to do the same. There was power in her tone, yes, but there was also deep intentionality. She wasn't loud for the sake of performance. She was forceful because the stakes demanded it. When people are dying because they can't afford the medication they need, what tone should one use? When families are buried in medical debt, how exactly is one supposed to sound? She brought urgency because the moment required it, and because people in pain don't have time for careful politics. Her presence reminded everyone that democracy isn't supposed to be neat or quiet. It's supposed to be honest. It's supposed to reflect the people it serves, not just the ones with power and polish. Crockett brought that authenticity in full force, and in doing so, she disrupted the comfort of those who are too used to dominating the conversation. She didn't ask for the room's permission. She took her place at the table, and she made it clear she wasn't leaving. You could feel the shift in the room, the discomfort, the resistance, but also the resonance. Because when someone speaks like that, when they bring the full weight of truth and lived experience to a space that prefers polite detachment, something changes. People lean in. People listen. Even the ones who want to dismiss her are forced to reckon with the fact that she will not be ignored. And it's not just about what she said, it's about what it represents. It represents a crack in the wall that separates the elite from the everyday. It represents a refusal to play by rules that were never written to protect the vulnerable. It represents a growing movement of voices who are done asking and ready to demand. Crockett wasn't there to make anyone comfortable. She was there to make change. And she understood that sometimes the first step to justice is making noise that cannot be silenced. In reclaiming her space and refusing to yield, she made a statement that will echo far beyond that hearing. She showed that representation isn't just about being in the room. It's about being heard in the room, fully, fiercely, unapologetically. And once that kind of voice is unleashed, it doesn't go back to quiet. It gets louder. It multiplies. It challenges. And it changes everything. Jasmine Crockett's voice didn't just rise in that room. It rippled far beyond it. In a moment that could have passed as just another tense exchange in a political hearing, she transformed it into something much more. A rallying cry. A refusal to accept silence as the price for participation, and a declaration that the voices of everyday people belong at the center of the national conversation. What made her stand out wasn't just her command of facts or her bold delivery. It was her authenticity. She didn't posture. She didn't soften her message to make it more palatable. She spoke like someone who has listened, really listened, to her constituents, to their worries, to their anger, and to their exhaustion. And then she carried those voices with her into a space that too often insulates itself from the reality of those lives. In an era when performative politics is everywhere, where viral moments often mean very little, Crockett's stand was different. It wasn't just for the cameras, it was for the people. She showed what it looks like when a representative actually represents. She wasn't afraid to confront uncomfortable truths. She wasn't afraid to disrupt the status quo. And most importantly, she wasn't afraid to be fully herself while doing it. Her refusal to be silenced was more than just personal courage. It was symbolic of something bigger. The rising wave of leaders, particularly women of color, who are demanding a seat at the table and the right to speak without restraint once they're there. Her message was loud and clear. Representation without voice is hollow. Real leadership requires volume, passion, and truth, even when, especially when, the room doesn't want to hear it. What happened in that hearing wasn't just about one clash over procedure or tone. It was about power, who has it, who gets to use it, and who is expected to stay quiet in its presence. Jasmine Crockett flipped that expectation on its head, and in doing so, she reminded all of us that the halls of power are not sacred ground for the few. They belong to the people. That moment will be remembered not just for the intensity of her words, but for what they stood for. She proved that You can be powerful and principled, passionate and prepared. She brought her community into that room with her, and she made it clear. They won't be ignored anymore. She didn't just speak truth to power. She was the power. And now that voice is louder, stronger, and impossible to overlook.